everyone. This is Michelle Rosecrans from Miami University Alumni Association. Today, we're proud to feature the Miami Presents webinar, Pets, Health, and Well-Being. Your instructor today is Alan McConnell. Dr. McConnell is a university distinguished professor and the chair of the psychology department at Miami University. His educational background includes a BA in psychology from the University of Cincinnati and a PhD in psychology from Indiana University. Dr. McConnell teaches courses on social psychology, positive emotions and well-being, psychology of conservation, attitudes, judgment and decision-making, and intergroup relations at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. He has a special interest in today's topic, the well-being and benefits of relationships with family and pets. We're really thankful to Alan for taking the time to join us today. As a side note, I was saying to Alan before we started that I'm usually nervous when hosting one of these webinars as to whether my dogs might start barking. Today, if they bark, I'm just going to let it happen because it feels like it's in line with our topic. I will say questions were collected during registration and we've shared those with Dr. McConnell, and he will address some of those throughout the webinar today. Please know that we won't be able to get to every single question that came in ahead of time or that will come in live. You will have that option to ask questions during the webinar. Just click the Ask a Question button that's just below the video image. Today's webinar is going to last about an hour, and we will take a few breaks for questions. Please feel free to send them in at any point during the webinar. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. McConnell.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm really happy to be here today. So what's your dog's name?
Well, we have a 13-year-old boxer. His name is Brutus. He came with the name. His previous owners were big Ohio State fans, but we've had him since he was a year and a half. And then we have a 3-year-old chocolate lab. His name is Bodie. He's also a rescue. Then we have a cat. His name is Fred Weasley. He's a ginger. And we do 3 fish. We have to mention those fish.
Absolutely. That sounds great.
So, a menagerie. How about you?
We just adopted a dog, Leo, who's a rescue about a year and a half ago. Okay. Before that, I went about 10 years without having a dog, which I found kind of interesting because
that is interesting.
The interview, the very first question is, well, tell me about your dogs and cats. And I was kind of like, I'm a scientist. I try to be agnostic on these things, but it's also the case that when you start seeing the benefits, you start feeling a little sheepish, no pun intended, right, for not having a pet of your own. So, yeah. So
I think that if you could use a lot of animal puns today, that would be great. It'd be awesome.
Yeah. And and the mail just got delivered a couple of minutes ago, so I'm hopeful that Leo will not be interrupting. But if he pops up right here, which he does when I'm working, it's just kind of good evidence for why we're studying this.
Exactly.
Well, thanks. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really happy to share with everyone some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing for now about a decade. Also really excited to be chair of the psychology department right now. We have a little bit over 1,000 undergraduate majors. We have 65 doctoral students in our PhD program. We have almost 40 faculty members and staff. I'm really, really proud of the way they pivoted in the middle of the spring following the COVID-19 developments. Within a couple of days, we went from being fully in person to doing online delivery. We didn't really skip a beat on that. And I'm really, really grateful to my colleagues for their hard work and dedication, and to our students as well, who, for a couple of days, we're kind of rolling with the punches, but I think that we finished really strong, and just, again, really appreciative of all my colleagues in the department and all the great students that we have, both undergraduate and graduate in our program. So anyway, I hope a few of them are out there watching, and hopefully I'll do you proud today. So I guess what I'll do is I'll kind of jump into my presentation for a little bit, and then I will come back, take a few questions, and then talk a little bit more about some of the research that we've been conducting in our lab in particular. So if that sounds okay, I will go ahead here, and hopefully my slides will pop up. Do you see them? Excellent. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Again, I'm really excited to share with you some of this research that we've been conducting. It's been a really great collaboration with a number of students in our lab. And again, we're kind of looking at a topic that I think has a lot of personal appeal. I'm sure many of you tuned in today because you have a pet. But the approach that we've been taking is trying to understand the psychology underlying how our relationships with pets affect us. And although I'm the person giving this talk, this research has been a longstanding collaboration for over a decade with several students in my lab. For example, Kristina Brown got her PhD in my lab back in 2009, and she's currently professor and chair of the psychology department at Arcadia University in Philadelphia. Paige Lloyd was my most recent PhD. She graduated a couple years back. She's now assistant professor at the University of Denver. Tanya Shota Buchanan, a former student as well, got her PhD in 2014 from Miami. She's currently an associate professor of psychology at Central Washington out in Ellensburg, Washington. A couple undergrads in my lab, Colleen Martin and Laura Staten, did senior thesis projects in our lab, and both of those were included in our really landmark paper in this area. So I'm really proud that they were not only involved in our lab, but are co-authors on the first paper that we really published that got us going on all this. It's also interesting that although they got their bachelor's degrees back in 2010, they were best friends as undergrads. They went off to separate PhD programs in clinical psychology, and then they both ended up getting hired by the VA in Cincinnati together. So they're back together as well. And the last shout out will go to Brandon Humphrey, who got his bachelor's degree in 2015, and he joined my lab after getting his bachelor's degree at Miami, and he'll be wrapping up his PhD next year in our social psychology program. So anyway, just want to acknowledge those important contributions from people in our lab. I probably don't have to convince anybody watching this that pets are really important in our lives, but I think it's kind of interesting to put some numbers onto that. So if we look at data, most recent data show that 67% of US households have a pet, and the annual spending on pets each year is $75 billion. So I thought it was interesting. I went back and looked at the data, and I thought I would kind of chart out, these are billions of dollars spent annually on pets in the United States. And one thing that you'll see here is that every single year spending has increased. So just a decade ago, it was less than 50 billion, and currently it's more than 75 billion. So it's really, really consequential for the economy. It's really, really consequential for a lot of reasons. In the annual year, we spend more money on pets than we do on Mother's Day, on Father's Day, on Valentine's Day, on the Super Bowl, and Halloween annually combined. Other than the holidays, we probably spend more money on pets than we do for anything except for vacations and holiday gifts. So really, really consequential. Probably not surprising that pets are really important to Miamians too. So from data from our lab, we know that looking at our undergraduates, on average, 80% of them have at least one pet, either at home or in their apartment. 70% report having at least one dog. 32% report having at least one cat. Looking at these undergraduates who have a dog or a cat, 77% of them consider that pet to be a family member just like anyone else. So here what we're seeing is a lot of evidence that it's not even just like they're important, but we view them as family members on par with lots of others. So these are just some photos from people with their animals, and some of these faces may look familiar because they all have these Miami connections. So Kristina Brown got her PhD in my lab. That's her with her cat Arwen, who is currently 18 years old. So Arwen came with her to Oxford and then moved with her to the East Coast, and Arwen is still with her today. Paige Lloyd recently got a flying squirrel, so that's what she's holding in her hand. Brandon Humphrey is actually in a photo holding Paige Lloyd's cats. And the photo on the far left is actually our holiday card that we sent out last year in my own family. So that's Leo, the yellow lab down at the bottom. And again, we're sending out a holiday card. We have to have the dog on it. So again, just kind of highlighting how important pets are to us. I think it's really important to point out that at some point, pets aren't human beings, and we view them yet so importantly. There's this great AP poll, a few years old at this point, but I think the data still are, still ring true, that 25% of pet owners who are married or cohabitating report that their pet is a better listener than their spouse or partner, which I don't know if that's an indictment of our relationships or a testimony to our pets, maybe a little bit of both, but that's a pretty striking statistic. When we look at data from our own lab, we see that people perceive their pets to be as supportive as their family members. So just to give you some data from one of our studies, we looked at data from 217 community members in Butler County. None of these were students. These were people that we were able to obtain in Butler County. 167 of them had a pet, 50 did not. And then we asked them to think about a variety of different entities in their life and to rate the amount of support they receive from them on a 7-point scale, where 1 means not at all and 7 means a great deal. And they were asked to think about their best friend, their parents, their siblings, and their pet. And what we saw among pet owners was that people reported just receiving as much support from their pet as they do from their siblings and from their parents. The only entity that outdid any of those was best friend. So these data show that people say, I get as much support from my pet as I do from my parents and my siblings. So here people are saying pets really, are really, really important parts of my lives, and they provide a great deal of social support. So this all is kind of interesting, maybe even cute. People say that pets are important to them, but does it really matter? And what I'm going to do today is talk about 3 prongs of research that we've conducted in our lab. I'll give you a little bit of background in a second from a few other findings in other labs, because we're not the only people studying these questions. But the first prong of research I'll talk about is evidence showing that pet owners experience better mental and physical health. The second prong of work is going to be looking at what happens when we view pets as family members. And spoiler alert, it's helpful. And then the last part of research we'll talk about is this idea of anthropomorphism. And anthropomorphism is when we view pets as having human-like qualities. And in particular, we're going to focus on socially supportive qualities. And I'll show you some data suggesting that anthropomorphism is kind of the glue that makes all this happen. And that basically viewing pets as having these socially supportive human qualities seems to be one of the reasons why pets provide these benefits. Now, earlier I showed you data suggesting that people say that they get as much social support from their pet as they do from their family members. So why should that affect well-being? Well, we know from a lot of data that general social support is critical for mental and physical health. So when people have greater social support, they have greater well-being, they have greater cardiovascular, endocrine, and immune functioning, and they also report greater self-worth and self-esteem. So basically what a lot of research has shown us with humans is that the quality, not necessarily the quantity, but the quality of our social support really matters. So you don't necessarily have to have 5,000 friends on Facebook or have 20,000 people following your Twitter or whatever the case may be. If you just have a few people who you think really get you, are there for you and understand you, you can have tremendous social support. And this social support affects us at a really low level in terms of how our hormones respond, how our brain adapts with stress, how we resist illnesses and things like that. So basically, we know this about human social support. So it might not be a leap to think that people might derive similar benefits from having relationships with pets. Another line of research that we've conducted in our lab that I really won't spend too much time on today is that we've also looked at how people view families and kind of construct this notion of family. And that research has shown that people who have families with greater social resource capacity, so families that are a little more tight with each other, families that have a lot of positive characteristics, families that people identify more with, these sort of social resources improve well-being. And some work that Tanya Buchanan did in her dissertation shows that when people have families that consist of a broader array of entities, so not just your parents and grandparents and siblings, but maybe it also includes your neighbors. Maybe you include a couple coworkers as family. And of course, maybe you include your pets as family. As that umbrella of family includes more and more types of entities, we see a lot of evidence for greater health and well-being as well. So if we look at the past literature, there is evidence that having pets in your life improves health. but the vast majority of these studies have been done with people facing rather significant health challenges. So, for example, research by Siegel shows that people who are Medicare patients require fewer physician visits when they have pets than when they do not have pets. There's other work looking at how people respond a year later after having a heart attack. And this really striking study shows that 1 year after having a heart attack, the likelihood of being dead is much greater when you don't have a pet than when you do have a pet. So 1 year following a heart attack, pet owners were only 1% likely to die during that next year, and non-pet owners were 7% more likely to die during that next year. There's also other work by Siegel and her colleagues showing that men who are HIV positive were less depressed when they have pets than when they do not. So this is all, kind of classic bread and butter research literature, but there's a couple of things to note from this work that kind of spurred our interest in this area. And the first is that all these studies are correlational in nature. So we know that correlations can be a really powerful way to look for relationships, but they don't establish cause and effect. So for example, it might be the case that people who have pets, maybe they have more financial means, and that's why they get a pet, because they can support the pet, buy it food, take it to the vet, things like that. So it could just be that people with pets maybe have more financial resources at their disposal, and those people may have better health care. And that might account for these sorts of relationships between pets and well-being. And you don't really need the pet per se. It's just that the pet is something that's a third variable. It's associated with the real cause, which might be having financial resources. So that's one issue with this area. The second issue is that all of these studies focus on people with significant health challenges. And although it's really important to understand how people might benefit under those circumstances, it's kind of an open question whether or not people would benefit if they're just everyday people. So people who aren't necessarily facing significant health challenges. Maybe a pet doesn't provide as much bang for the buck for those people, but for people who are facing a lot of health stressors, it might be really, really important. So what I'm going to focus on today is research from our lab that's tackling both of those issues. One is, do pets enhance the well-being of everyday people? We see a lot of evidence that it matters for people facing health challenges, but does it matter for everyday people as well? And in the last decade, we've published several papers that have explored this, looking at how people with pets maybe are healthier, how people can deal with social rejection in an experimental way when they think about animals, how putting animals in your family matter, thinking about the way that we construct social relationships as well. So our bottom line in this research is that pets can enhance well-being for everyday people too. So in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about 3 lines of work that we've conducted in our lab. And the first is going to look at whether pet owners compared to non-pet owners fare better. And what we see is that there is evidence that they have greater self-esteem. They report that they get more exercise. They're more physically fit. They're more conscientious. So conscientious is a personality characteristic that's really diagnostic of faring well. So are you organized? Do you get things done? Things like that. Pet owners tend to be more extroverted. So basically, being extroverted is also associated with a lot of positive outcomes. You're maybe more likely to have social resources, more likely to be able to interact with others in more effective ways. And pet owners tend to be less lonely as well. So this is one of the findings that we've had in our set of research. In a little bit, I'll talk about some other findings, but I thought this might be a good spot to maybe take a break, and we maybe can take a few questions from the audience.
Okay, so I do have a few questions. Alan, I think you might be on mute. Are you?
Yeah, there I am. I'm sorry about that.
Awesome. No problem. No problem. Okay, so we have had a few come in, and then there are a couple that came in early that I thought we could talk about. So we had a couple of questions that I thought were really interesting. One was, do pets need to be cuddly to have a positive psychological ecological impact? And then related, how much of a positive impact do non-mammal pets have? So what do you have to say about that?
Oh, that's interesting. So the cuddly thing is interesting because a little bit later I want to talk about anthropomorphism. And so there's been kind of two striking findings in our work that, frankly, if I was a betting person, I would have betted against, but the data are the data. And one thing that we find over and over and over again is that the type of pet that people have doesn't seem to matter in terms of the health and well-being benefits that they get. So we often think, oh, I bet dogs and cats will be really beneficial, but a bird or a goldfish or an iguana can't have the same benefits. What we have found is it really doesn't matter. It seems like when people bond with a pet, they typically tend to anthropomorphize it. So even if it's a cold-blooded creature like an iguana or a snake, or it's something like a goldfish or a flying squirrel in my former grad student's case, it really seems to be about whether you feel like you have a connection with it, whether you feel like it gets you, whether or not you think it's concerned about you if you're having a bad day, things like that. That seems to be the key. So the cuddliness, if it feeds into anthropomorphism, might matter. But again, when we went into this, we thought, well, and again, being agnostic and not having a pet previously, I didn't have pun intended, a dog in this race, but I would have probably guessed that dogs would be more than cats and then fish and but our data really show it's really all in your own mind. It's about the way that you socially construct the relationship and the qualities that you project out to the pet.
Makes sense to me. Okay, let's see. We also have had a couple of questions come in related. So given your research, should it be easier for students at Miami to bring their pets to dorms? And then someone else said other universities offer on-campus dorm living that allows for pets like cats, hamsters, fish, etc. And given the strong correlation between mental health and having pets, the question was, does Miami ever plan to offer on-campus pet-friendly options? I know that's not something that you can answer, but could you talk about university housing pets, maybe trends that you are aware of, or just what you have to say about, to that question?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't control that policy. And I know that, there's a variety of issues that make that complicated. So, in the dorms or in classrooms, you had to deal with issues like if the pet's not hypoallergenic, that can be an issue for people who have allergies. The pets need to have a certain degree of training. You don't want to have someone bring in a dog into a classroom and suddenly the dog goes crazy and becomes a distraction and things like that. I do know that Miami has a decent number of undergrads who are working with dogs, like Paws for Ability and things like that. These groups that are training dogs to be social support animals, to be assisted companion animals, things like that. And whenever I have any of those dogs in the classroom, I love it because they kind of sit there. They're getting good socialization experiences, so it's really good for the pets and their training. But it's also really, I think, beneficial for the classroom. So I really hope that if there are people out there listening, that there's more receptivity to that. There's a lot of companies in the Bay Area, for example, a lot of tech firms that allow pets to come in, and anecdotally, people report a lot of well-being benefits from that. There's this really classic, great study that Karen Allen, she's a psychologist at SUNY Buffalo, has done over the years, and she's got this really great study that shows that if you're doing really challenging math problems and you're in a room with your dog, you can do better at those math problems, and you show less physiological reactivity. So your blood pressure is lower, your pulse rate is reduced. And I know that Miami during finals week often has, both in Armstrong as well as in different buildings throughout campus, they'll bring therapy dogs around to kind of hang out with students during finals week. So I think all these are pretty good pieces of evidence that there's a lot of benefits to it. Again, I think you have to manage some things there, but I would certainly encourage anyone, whether you own a business or whether you run a university, President Crawford, to give it a little thought.
So related to that, and I do want to say I also love it when the therapy mini horses come to town. That's a lot of fun. That makes me think of there's a mini horse at CVG, the Cincinnati Airport, that's around sometimes for emotional support and comfort. And I just think that's fantastic. So we've had a couple of questions that don't seem related, but and maybe this can be our last one before we transition, but someone asked about the correlation between having pets around and lower blood pressure. And then someone else asked how you feel about cat cafes. And so the reason that I tie those two together is, if you're someone who, for whatever reason, can't have a pet, access to an animal and being able to go snuggle a cat at a cat cafe, do you feel like there are benefits there as well? Or is that occasional contact not enough to show any sort of results?
I think occasional contact can matter greatly. I mean, lots of studies show that 20 minutes after petting, not only a dog, but even when people pet a stuffed animal, their cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, drop significantly. So just even having really minimal interactions with animals, again, positive interactions, obviously. If you're terrified of a pit bull and there's like a Rottweiler who comes into a room, you're not going to get benefits from that. You're just going to be like full of anxiety. But there's a lot of data that show that even small amounts of contact matter. There's also some really interesting studies that show that it not only has benefits for people, but has benefits for pets as well. So they actually have looked at cortisol levels in like dogs. So if you go and just pet a dog for a few minutes, the dog actually gets physiological benefits as well. So I think things like cat cafes probably can have benefits. I think the other sort of benefit, and I think some people who don't necessarily have pets or can't have pets experience this as well, that if you can hang out with your friends or family members who have pets and get a little bit of that sort of like pet fix in, that might be better than taking a plunge and getting a cat and then realizing a few months later that maybe you don't have the time to take care of that animal. So I think for a lot of people, whether it's a busy lifestyle or something like that, those opportunities are probably beneficial for many reasons.
Fantastic. Well, we'll pause on questions for now and I'll let you get back to your presentation and I'll keep an eye on what else is coming in.
Okay, great. And then we'll have some more questions at the end. So
great.
Okay. So just to kind of go back to where we were, again, we find in our lab that when we look at pet owners compared to non-pet owners, they have lots of benefits. As I mentioned, greater self-esteem, they tend to be less lonely, they have more positive personality characteristics like being conscientious and extroverted. In another study that we did, we looked at people who were considering adopting a pet. So we went to the Animal Adoption Foundation, which is outside of Ross, Ohio. So if any of you have ever driven to Oxford going up US 27, when you leave Cincinnati, for a while it's a divided highway, and then it becomes a 2-lane road right after Ross. About a mile and a half beyond that kind of reduction to a 2-lane road, if you look on the right as you're heading up to Oxford, you've probably seen this building down below, which is the Animal Adoption Foundation. So one summer, we went there and we tracked people who came in looking for pets. So people were looking for dogs or they were looking for cats. When people adopted a pet, we followed up with them 2 months later. So when they came in and looked at a pet, we had them fill out a bunch of questionnaires. And then later, if they did adopt, we followed up with them 2 months later to see how they were doing by having them complete those questionnaires again. And one thing that we found was that when people adopted a dog or cat, it didn't matter. 2 months later, their level of depression was lower than it was when they came in. So we're seeing significant reductions in depressed affect for people who adopt a pet. Another thing that we found that was interesting was going back to that anthropomorphism piece. To the extent that people anthropomorphize the pet they adopted to a greater degree, the drops in depression were especially pronounced. And we saw correlations of 0.7 looking at that. So for those of you who had some statistical background, that's a really strong relationship. That basically is saying that we can basically predict 50% of the drop in depression by knowing how much people anthropomorphize the pet. So these are some of the studies that we've conducted in our lab. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the criticisms of a lot of the work in the literature is that it's correlational, and these studies are correlational as well. Like, we did not randomly assign people to adopt a pet or not when they went to the AAF looking for a pet. We can't randomly assign people to take away their pet to see whether or not they have a drop in self-esteem or things like that. So these studies here are all correlational, but I want to share with you a couple of studies that we have done that are experimental. So one of these experimental studies was trying to look at whether or not pets can stave off negativity from social rejection. So for many people, I'm sure this is a pretty common experience that you've had a really bad day at work. Maybe some project blew up on you, or maybe, you had a fight with a family member or something. And then you come back to your house and you're really kind of bummed out, and you open the door and there's Fido or there's Fluffy. Does having your pet there in that moment actually help you feel better? I think everyone anecdotally has this sense that their stress, their kind of sense of being down is kind of offset by having their pet there. But it's an open question as to whether or not that actually happens in real life. So this study I'm about to tell you about was that analog of what happens when you have a social rejection experience that we induce in the lab, and then you get a chance to think about your pet. Does that really offset the negativity that you have from that social rejection experience? So in this particular study, we brought in nearly 100 Miami undergraduates, and they completed a well-being measure that's called the social needs scale. So basically what this is a measure of is it looks at people at their self-esteem, their sense of a meaningful existence, their sense of belonging, their sense of feeling like they have control over things. So it's a broad-based measure of well-being. So they come into the lab and they complete this measure right at the very beginning of the study. Then afterwards, based on a coin flip, they either write about a time when they felt socially rejected. So this is our experimental manipulation to induce a feeling of rejection. Or in a control condition, they just wrote about what they did the day before when they woke up. So this first activity is to either experimentally induce a sense of rejection, or in the control condition, not to really have any sort of positive or negative impact on them. So they wrote for 5 minutes, either about a time they were rejected or about what they did yesterday. Immediately after that 5-minute writing exercise, we had them take part in a second activity where they wrote again for 5 minutes. 1/3 of our participants wrote about why they liked their best friend. Another third of the participants wrote about why they liked their pet. And another group, our control condition, just drew a map of campus. So what we have here are 6 different conditions. Half of our participants are writing about rejection, half are just writing about what they did yesterday, which is a control group. And then immediately afterwards, they either write about why they like their best friend, why they like their pet, or again, in another control condition, they drew a map of campus. And then immediately after that second activity, they completed the basic needs scale again, which allows us to take a look at how they felt at the end of the experiment compared to the very beginning. So these are the data from the study. This y-axis here is the change in their sense of social needs fulfillment. So this is kind of a general sense of self-esteem and belonging and things like that. So as scores go up in a positive direction, people felt relatively better at the end of the experiment compared to the beginning. So let's take a look at this first group of bars right here. These are the people in the control condition. They didn't write about a rejection experience. They just wrote about what they did yesterday. And then their second activity, they either wrote about their pet for 5 minutes, their best friend for 5 minutes, or they drew the campus map for 5 minutes. So what we see here is, people feel a little bit better at the end of the study when they get to write about their pet or best friend. Drawing the map is not intrinsically a bad thing. We see basically a small shift from the beginning of the study to the end. What about the people we're most interested in, the people who are in the rejection condition? Again, this is kind of the analog of you having that kind of like awful day, and then you come home and you have a chance to maybe see a best friend or see your pet. So people in the rejection condition who just spent 5 minutes after that rejection experience drawing a map about campus felt a lot worse at the end of the experiment compared to the beginning. So this is a big negative number here. However, when people got to write about their best friend, it took away that negativity. So even though the people who didn't get a chance to think about their best friend or pet felt really bad at the end of the study, Writing about your best friend for 5 minutes took all that negativity away. And here, obviously, the critical question is what happened when you got to write about your pet? We see the same effect. Now, this effect looks like the pet is better for you than your best friend. Statistically, that's not the case. Statistically, these two are the same, but they're both better than this condition here. So what this is telling us is that when you really do feel rejected, and again, we experimentally induced this in the lab, thinking about your pet was statistically just as good as thinking about your best friend, and both of them were better than a kind of neutral experience like drawing a map of campus that leaves you still feeling pretty bummed. So this is some experimental evidence that when you come home from work after a bad day and your dog is there wagging his or her tail, you do get benefits from that. So as I mentioned before, we've really been interested in this idea of anthropomorphism. We really think anthropomorphism is kind of like the psychological glue for why these well-being effects exist. So basically the idea is that if you think your pet has the ability to have all these socially supportive characteristics, like the pet cares about you, it's considerate, it's empathetic, then you get these well-being benefits. I want to tell you about two different lines of work here as we kind of button up our work in our lab. One is looking at whether people who tend to anthropomorphize to a greater degree get more well-being benefits out of exposure to animals. And then I'll talk about a paper that we published just a few months ago showing that if we include our pets as members of our family, we get well-being benefits, but it seems to be explained through anthropomorphism. So let me talk about this first line of work. This is some work that Kristina Brown did after she left Miami, but I was fortunate enough to be a co-author on this work. So what we did in this study was we had people come in, people who were greater in propensity to anthropomorphize. So these are people who tend to look at an animal and think that the animal has feelings, the animal has thoughts, the animal has plans. So I think some people anthropomorphize a lot more than others. So you can think about people who think that their dog is thoughtful, or that their cat is sneaky, or that trees have feelings. People who have that anthropomorphize to a greater degree, they see more human capacity in others. And we're interested in whether people who anthropomorphize more might get greater well-being benefits from being exposed to animals. So in this study, we had people start off by completing what we call an individual difference measure. So this is basically just seeing who has more of this quality than somebody else. So we're interested in trying to measure the extent to which people anthropomorphize more on a greater degree from day to day. So people who anthropomorphize more think that cheetahs probably experience stronger emotions than people who anthropomorphize less. Or people who anthropomorphize more think that reptiles have more consciousness than people who anthropomorphize less. So these are items from this scale that Adam Waits and his colleagues developed a few years ago. So we first measured how much people on average tend to anthropomorphize. And then kind of going back to the study I just talked about before, half of our participants wrote about a rejection experience that they had experienced. And another group, our control condition, just wrote about a minor injury. We wanted something to be negative, but the rejection experience is kind of more social in nature, whereas the minor injury is more kind of non-social in nature. Immediately after the rejection experience, they took the basic needs scale. That was the same measure that we used in the previous study. And then after that, everyone spent 5 minutes looking at a series of slides of animals. So on the computer monitor, different pictures of animals, dogs and cats and birds and things like that would appear one at a time for a few seconds each, and people just viewed the animals. And then after they did that, we had them complete the basic needs scale at the very end. So basically what we're looking at here is how viewing animals affected their basic needs. So we expected people, after they wrote about a rejection experience, to feel kind of bummed out at time one. But then if you anthropomorphize a lot, would your basic needs rebound after viewing animals for a period of time? And that's basically what we saw here. We saw evidence that people in the rejection condition, so this y-axis here is people's improvement in basic needs at the end of the study compared to earlier in the study. So people showed the most rebound in their positivity when they got rejected, but they had an opportunity to look at animals, but they were high in anthropomorphism. So basically feeling rejected, people who tend to anthropomorphize more we're able to look at these animals and get more of a well-being benefit from seeing them. And the last study I'm going to talk about today is looking at what happens when we view pets as family members. Again, this is another story about anthropomorphism. And basically, our research has shown that because we view family to be such an important group in our lives, it's the most supportive, most important in-group that the average person reports having. If we view our pets as being family members, might this lead us to have greater well-being benefits by applying these kind of socially supportive attributes to our pets? So in other words, we expect social support from our family. If we make our pet a member of the family, do those socially supportive traits get applied to the pet? And as I mentioned earlier, 77% of dog and cat owners say that their pet is family. And basically, people view their pets as socially supportive as other family members like siblings and parents. So in this study, basically what we want to look at is this notion of a continuum. So there's kind of this idea that people can vary in the extent to which we ascribe human qualities to them, ranging from animals at one end to being fully human at the other. So our basic idea is this. We can think about an animal like my dog here, Leo, as an animal, but if we think about Leo as being a member of the family, we bring Leo up the humanist continuum, and thus not only is he a member of the family, but all these socially supportive characteristics that we associate with our family, like sympathy, thoughtfulness, considerateness, come along for the ride. So the basic idea here is what we call a mediational model. Viewing your pet as a family member improves your well-being, but it does it because we view our pets as having more of these socially supportive anthropomorphic traits. So this is basically what we're going to test in this final study. We did some correlational work here, but let me just talk about an experimental study here, and then I'll wrap up my presentation. So in this particular study, what we did was we brought in people who had pets. These were 152 Miami undergraduates. And at the very beginning of the study, they just completed a happiness scale so we could make sure that they kind of came in with an equivalent level of happiness. Next, we asked our participants to write about a time when their pet made them think one of two different things, and they were randomly assigned to one of these two conditions. Half of our participants were told to think about a time when their pet made them really feel like that their pet was a member of their family. The other half of our participants were told, think about a time when your pet made you really feel like your pet is an animal. And it turns out it's not hard for people to do this. So these are a couple real examples that we had in our data. So a participant here on the left who was in the pet is family experimental condition said, my dog knows when someone in our family is upset. When my mother's brother passed away, she was sad, and the dog would lay next to her to comfort her. So that's this idea of the pet being in the family. You can see the anthropomorphism, the considerateness, the sympathy. The example on the right is someone who is assigned to the pet is animal condition, and this person talked about Zoe, who's a part beagle, who has some hunting dog traits, and one day came back to the door with a bird that she slashed out of the air and ripped its head off. She brought it back to us as if it was a trophy and placed it at our feet. So the basic idea of this manipulation is people can kind of view their pet as a family member or as an animal. This is giving us an experimental nudge to push people in different directions to see the consequences. After they wrote about their pet as either a family member or animal, we had them complete the basic needs scale again, and then we had them rate the extent to which their pet had anthropomorphic qualities. So to what extent their pet had sympathy, empathy, considerateness, things of that nature. So what we saw in this study is that people who were asked to think about their pet as a family member at the end of the study showed more positive well-being at the end of the study than people who wrote about their pet as an animal. Again, remember the people in these two conditions were just randomly assigned based on a coin flip to either think about their pet as a family member or as an animal, but we see a significant difference here in well-being such that people who thought about their pet as a family member viewed the pet as more of a had greater well-being benefits. And this is what we call mediational model here. I won't go into all the math behind it, but basically it shows that we can account for the effect that viewing your pet as family has on improved well-being by taking into account the anthropomorphism. So in other words, this effect that viewing your pet as a family member improves your well-being goes away if we take anthropomorphism out of the equation. So it seems as if viewing your pet as having these qualities of being considerate and supportive is really, really important for well-being. So just to summarize the work here that I presented, then we'll take some questions. Pets, I would argue, play an important role in enhancing our well-being for everyday people. We see evidence that pet owners have better mental and physical health. Pets can help offset the negativity from a social rejection experience. We found evidence that adopting a pet led to reductions in depressed affect. It seems like anthropomorphism is really, really important for why these well-being benefits happen. So people who just on average tend to be more likely to anthropomorphize animals can benefit following a social rejection experience just from viewing animals and including pets in our most important in-group, our family, enhances our well-being. And again, this seems to be accounted for by anthropomorphism. I didn't have time to talk about it today, but right now I'm involved in a research effort down at Cincinnati Children's Hospital where we're studying the role of anthropomorphism and its benefits in children who've had head injury trauma. So basically we've been looking at children who've had head injuries, they come in for therapy, and we're looking at whether their relationship with their therapy dog predicts positive outcomes in terms of rehabilitation. And this is work that we've been conducting for a couple years, and that work is still ongoing, but just want to kind of give a shout out for that. So at the end, I'd like to again thank my grad students who've been really instrumental on this research effort. I'd like to thank NICHD for supporting our research. Many undergrads over the years in our lab who have been really active in important parts of this research as well. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. So thank you very much.
Well, that is great timing. We have a number of wonderful questions that have come in. So put that thinking cap on, Dr. McConnell. So here's a question that came in during the webinar. Has any research been done on wild backyard animals versus domesticated animals and their effects on humans? For example, during quarantine, this person has been, feeding squirrels, birds, and rabbits, and that's been really important to them. So what do you think about that?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of any research that's directly compared those, but I would think that if you're feeding birds or squirrels or putting out, sweetened water for hummingbirds and things like that, and you're paying attention to them, and maybe you're talking to your partner or somebody about, oh, look, Barney the squirrel's back and things like that, you're probably engaging in a lot of those anthropomorphic sort of responses. Like you're interested in them. You may not be getting the same sense of like they care about me as much, but you might think they appreciate your feeding them and things like that. So there might be some degree of give and take. So if I was just judging, I'd probably say those effects are probably smaller, but they probably exist to some degree. But I don't know if anyone's actually studied that. That's a great question.
So this next question I really love for several reasons. So the question is, can you receive positive benefits from watching pets on screen, like in movies or on social media? And I love this question because my daughter and I love to watch Secret Life of Pets. We think that is just the funniest. And then, of course, you're talking about, I always stumble over
Anthropomorphism.
Thank you. And of course, that's what's going on in Secret Life of Pets. All these animals are talking to one another and they have personalities, and that's what makes it so great. And then, of course, on social media, there are any number of really delightful accounts that, show dogs and cats doing silly things. And I'm here for that. So I feel like I know the answer to this. Yeah, there's totally benefit to it, but could you talk about it as the professional on this?
I think you just kind of nailed it. If we go back to that study that Kristina and her student and I conducted, just people who tend to anthropomorphize more, just watching little 5-second bursts of here's a dog, there's a fish, there's a cat, there's a bird. Even people who anthropomorphize got benefits from that, and they weren't interacting. It was like a two-dimensional image. So I would think that if there's a character, whether it's a Disney or a Pixar sort of movie, and it's really engrossing, a lot of those films give them human characteristics. There's a dog with a French accent, and they wear clothes and things like that. I mean, that's really just kind of cranking up the anthropomorphism. So I would think that those sorts of features probably are really effective for the same reasons.
Yeah, I just, plus all the animal puns, they're great. Let's see, is Leo trying to get in on the action?
He is actually right here, so I won't move the camera for fear that it will.
Okay.
There he is.
Hey, Leo. Oh,
that's Leo.
Assistant. So, kind of on the flip side, the less the emotional downsides. We've had a number of questions about grief and pets, and I wonder what, if any, of your research has looked into. I don't know. Like, is there research about how we recover when our hearts are broken in a pet situation, or is that something that you look at in your lab, and what do you think there?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's something that we haven't looked at in our lab yet. It's kind of on our drawing board of things to look at. It's a question that comes up a lot. There has been a little bit of work looking at pet grief. The work, and I'm probably really generalizing it to a pretty strong degree here, but it kind of shows that grief for pets looks very much like grief for people in terms of the stages, in terms of kind of the sense of loss, the physiological experiences people have. I think, it's been pointed out a lot that one of the challenges of pet grief is that although when it comes to human grief, we have a lot of institutions for that. There's religious practices that really almost prescribe how one should grieve. We have all sorts of rituals and in ways that we engage that. People kind of don't know how to handle that when it comes to people's pets. I think there are a lot of people who feel tremendous empathy and sympathy for people, but then there are other people who are like, it was just a dog, get over it. And I think that reflects that kind of not appreciating the importance of that. So it's also the case where, at some point we all deal with loss, whether it's someone in our family or a close friend. But because pets, the pets that we tend to keep, like dogs and cats, they probably have a 10 to 15 year sort of cycle with us. People often go through 3 or 4, passings with their pets that, make it really challenging. So it's something we would love to study and, to a greater degree. I think it's really, really important. And with a lot of our research, we got involved with pets trying to understand kind of people's connection with animals, but we study it. I'm a social psychologist. I'm not an animal psychologist because I'm interested in understanding people. So if I can look at Leo right now here on the floor and project him with all these qualities, that the rational part of me knows that he really doesn't possess a lot of these human qualities. Some of this is just artifacts of being a dog and canine, sort of evolution. That doesn't matter because if it's in my head that's that way, then that's where the benefits come from. It's a social projection. And for me as a social psychologist, I would say the same thing applies to a lot of our human relationships as well. A lot of the benefits we get from our friendships, a lot of benefits we get from the people that we know are also social projections in the same way. So I think that it's not surprising to me that grief is one of those dimensions that probably has a lot of comparability. Again, partly about the importance of these animals, but also about our social needs and how we view pets as filling them.
That makes sense. Here's a COVID-19 related question. With the recent uptick in pet adoptions from shelters, these quarantine adoptions, do you think it will help our society understand how pets affect us emotionally, especially in times of crisis?
Well, that's a really great question. It's really pretty amazing to take a look at all the anecdotal evidence that's out there. So I know there's been a lot of stories like New York Times last month had this really interesting piece looking at what's going to happen to our pets when we go back to work. And they're getting so used to all this attention that, like Leo would spend half his day just, hanging out on the sofa waiting for us to come home. And now if I go to the closet to grab a shirt, he's worried that I've disappeared and everything like that. So I think the symbiotic relationship that we have with our pets during the global pandemic is really, really powerful. And I think that one thing that we are learning a lot more about is how, their importance is probably really evident to pet owners. Both because, fortunately, the WHO suggests that, pets don't transmit COVID-19. I'm not a doctor, but that's what the WHO says. So it's one of the outlets that people have right now for social engagement. You may not be able to hug your best friend, but you can hug your puppy, you can hug your cat. So I think in many ways, it's helping us probably discover that sense of connection, but it's probably even more poignant when our normal outlets with people, our normal sort of ways to engage with the world are more limited as well.
You mentioned the New York Times article, and I know you and I had spoken ahead of time about some of the questions that were outside of your area, but you had some resources for folks. And so I do want to say, note that we'll send some links out to recommended articles in an email to follow up to everyone who registered for this. But let's see. Let me grab a couple more questions here. Okay, so this question, do different personality types tend to choose one kind of pet or a different breed or whatever over another?
I love this question because it was something that we spent 2 years chasing our tail over, not to have another bad pet pun.
I love it.
But we had that hypothesis as well. And you can just think about how, introverts will like cats and jocks will like the sporting animals. We had all these predictions. There's even measures of pet personality. So not human personality, but actual measures of pet personality as well. So we did several studies over a 2-year period trying to match up all these human personality characteristics with pet characteristics. And to make a short story short, we got nothing. And I think it's partly because a lot of pets in our lives kind of come to us not through choice. It might be a stray that shows up on your doorstep and you're like, this cat doesn't have a collar, let's take it in. Or you go to the kennel thinking you're going to get that golden retriever, but the Chihuahua steals your heart. So I think that, or maybe the parents are like, we're going to get, a Great Dane, but their daughter goes there and falls in love with a corgi. So how we end up with the pets is often more of a random walk than deliberate choice. But yeah, we had those hypotheses, and I thought we did a bang up job trying to explore them, but we were surprised as anybody that the sort of relationships that you would expect just really weren't there.
Well, this feels like a great place to wrap up, and we're closing in on our hour here. I do want to acknowledge that we did have a number of questions that we were not able to get to, and also some folks sharing their stories about, in their workplaces as, someone who's a hospice chaplain, with the importance of patients being able to be around their pets during that time, and other folks sharing how much they appreciate programs that train animals to be support animals for our military veterans and things like that. And I wish that we could talk about pets for, another hour or so, and I bet we could, but this feels like a good place to wrap it up. So I do want to thank you again, Dr. McConnell, for leading our webinar today. And for all of you watching, I'd like to encourage you to follow us on social media at Miami Alum for news of other upcoming virtual programs. And then please do check out our list of upcoming webinars, including tomorrow night, another wine tasting with Professor Jack Keegan. I believe it's sparkling wines tomorrow night. I'm not sure. If you sign up, though, you'll get all the information. And then we do have a virtual alumni weekend coming up June 11th through 13th. So we'll have some more webinars then, and lots of other good fun that you can do from your home. So with that, thank you again, Dr. McConnell.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. And everyone have a nice day. Thank you. Love and honor.